Hi, welcome to Table Ready Gaming. I'm Dave, and today we're just gonna have some fun painting a dwarf miniature that I have. So I started this miniature how I typically do, by priming it white and then covering it with Reaper Strong Tone. I really like how the inks will bring out the detail and let me see the dark crevices of this miniature. I wanted this to be a pale miniature as I'm trying to experiment with new flesh tones to get variety in the characters on the table. It seems so easy to just go back to the tried and true formulas that we know, and sometimes you just have to play around and see what you can come up with. This paint wasn't completely covering up the primer, so I did have to go over it a few times to get a smooth, even coverage. For the highlight, I mixed the skin tone with an off-white. This really brightened up the color. And I painted it to the raised surfaces of the model on the skin. This simulates light hitting the miniature and really can make detail pop. This dwarf miniature being painted here is Reaper's Dain Deepaxe from their 25th anniversary line. I did make a small modification to him because I wasn't fond of the giant horns he had on top of his head. So with a pair of clippers and some files, I was able to take that off, no problem. Afterwards, I decided to add a little bit of pinkish red to the miniature, especially on the cheeks and the nose. I like to think that this dwarf was drinking heavily. I decided that I want that dwarf to have a little bit brighter of a red nose, so I mixed in some red. Next, I decided to do a wash to bring down the face and add some shadow into the detail. This also helps blend in the red and the bright pink and that extreme white highlight, making the face look more uniformed. I think when we're painting skin tone, a lot of people forget about blemishes, and the fact that most people's skin isn't a smooth complexion. And I think by adding these blemishes and things to the skin, it can really add some fun detail to a miniature. I think most people know Reaper for their bones miniatures. I know that my local game store sure carries a lot more bones than they do pewter miniatures. However, Reaper has had a long catalog of amazing pewter sculpts, and these miniatures are highly detailed and cleanly cast. It's hard to beat Bones Mini's price, and I sure use them in my RPG games, but at the end of the day, I do feel like Reaper sculpts are much better in pewter. I, for one, am very curious to see how the Bones Black miniature line continues to develop. Once all the skin was painted, I decided that I was going to give this guy a blue theme, and I decided to paint all his clothing this royal blue color. I find it to be really striking, and I think blue is a good color for dwarves. Personally, I know a lot of folks come up with their characters, then they try to find an RPG miniature to go along with them. I think that's what's leading to the growing print-on-demand market. Sometimes I find it more fun to find a miniature and develop my character around that. Once I see the sculpt or the look of the miniature, it seems easier to develop a backstory and personality for the character. I think of this as my RPG casting call. That's exactly what happened with this character. Afterwards, I decided to start painting the eyes of the miniature. As I've said before, deck tan is an amazing color if you have to paint a light color over a dark. Plus, not using a pure white can really avoid the cartoon-looking eyes that some miniatures have. I started by just painting a horizontal line in where the eyes should be. Next, I took a black paint and put little dots in where the pupils. You can also paint vertical lines to get a more smooth pupil if the eyes are smaller. The main trick here is to make sure you don't make your miniature cross-eyed, and try to pick a focal point that the eyes are looking. Either paint both pupils slightly to the left or slightly to the right. Next, I decided to paint this dwarf's beard, since, like any good dwarf, he's mainly metal and hair. So putting down a deep brown I thought would really make the miniature pop. Again, I didn't really have any plans when painting this miniature, I was just kind of making it up as I went along. but I think the dark browns and blues really contrast well together, as they both have a cooler palette and cooler tone to the miniature. I knew I needed a dwarven mercenary for an upcoming game, as my players had a brief encounter with a mercenary party comprised of a dwarf, a human, and a half-orc, who were working against them to accomplish the same goal. I really didn't have much of a backstory for this nameless NPC until I started painting this miniature. During the painting process, the little guy just seemed to come to life, and his backstory just sort of flowed from the model itself. Unfortunately, our party's cleric one-shotted the dwarf, and he was dragged kicking and screaming into a portal to the Nine Hells before I had a chance to really develop his character. That's okay. His character's backstory can easily be modified and added to a new adversary. Plus, we all know dwarven clans hold grudges, and I'm sure his family will not be excited to learn of his fate. Next, I decided to do a black leather. Again, I was just painting this miniature quickly to get him ready for the table. Also, I did lay down some bright silver from scale 75 on some of his metal, especially the helmet and his shoulder pads. Unfortunately, that video file became corrupted, so I had to skip that step. When putting down this black color, I did use a slightly off black color, and so this is actually a really dark gray and not true black that's being laid down. That way I can still shadow the miniature with pure black. And while the detail is subtle, you will notice it when you pick it up and take a closer look. Next, I decided to use the dark gold from scale 75 and paint these little rivulet things around his waist. They look like little bits of metal, and I think gold and lots of metallics really can make a dwarf pop. And I wanted to kind of also go with the idea that he was a mercenary and carried most of his wealth on his person. Plus, being a dwarf, he's probably flamboyant and likes to show off the mineral wealth that he has. Next, I decided to start painting on his axe. I didn't want to do anything super extravagant on this guy, because again, we're painting him for a game session that was only 2 days away. However, I still wanted to make it look clean and the weapon well cared for. I think any dwarf worth his salt will pride himself on his weapon and his ability to take care of it. So I try to avoid things like rust and grime, as I just don't think it belongs on a finely crafted weapon like this. I think adding the different shades of metal really gives some contrast to this dwarf, and makes it look like his weapons are made of a higher caliber or higher craftsmanship than most mundane weapons of the world. However, he is just a mercenary, so I didn't want to give him too much bling on his weapons. But I do think the majority of his gold would be going to maintaining and carrying the tools of his trade. Especially for a dwarf. While painting this mini, I was just having fun with it, using this as a de-stressor palette cleanser. I didn't really have any thoughts on what this miniature should have on him, or really put much thought into his color palette. I wasn't trying to match any larger army or any preconceived ideas. This certainly isn't my best work, but sometimes I think we get too caught up on perfection and forget about the joy of simple creation. Don't get discouraged if something on your workbench isn't coming out exactly as you see it in your head. Next, I just went back to my off-white color and painted his drinking horn here. This was a fun little detail, and I wanted to make sure that it popped off the miniature. Then I went back to my classic parasite brown and started painting his backpack. His backpack has lots of great details and little tools strapped to it. Really makes him look like he's a traveling adventurer that carries all of his possessions with him wherever he goes. Then I decided to take the same off-white color as before and paint his bedroll. I then used my driftwood brown to paint the handle of his pickaxe. I wanted it to be a little bit darker and different from the weapons that he was carrying. I then used that same brown to pick out the little pouch and also paint the scabbard for his knife on the back. I then added some metal detail to this little pipe thing he had on the side of his back. I'm not 100% sure what it's supposed to be, but since he was a dwarf, I figured metallic was probably the safest color to paint it. I then painted the rings and the little icons on his drinking horn the same metallic color. I thought this blinged up the drinking horn and made it look particularly dwarven crafted. I believe that the dwarves would ban most things, and fine metals and precious gems. I then used the Scuffiest brown to add some more colors to the miniature, specifically the shield, as I thought a bright yellow shield would go well in contrast with his blue on his armor and his clothing. And I thought one of the coolest features of this miniature was his shield, and the fact that it had this really ornate boar on the shield. I thought that was a little bit of a nod to his fighting style. And while he didn't really get a chance to use the attack, I did decide to give him a nice charge ability. And that attack simply came from this miniature idea, as I figured he probably has this as his icon because he fights like a boar. Or perhaps he's just extremely stubborn. Who knows? I then used the driftwood brown from before to paint the straps on his bedroll. Again, I wanted this dwarf to look like he was well equipped and well funded, but he's not a lord by any means. It certainly still has to work for his meal, so his stuff can't look too fancy. I then had to put a second coat on his shield once it was dried. I find that 2 thinner coats is a great way to get nice, clean coverage of a miniature. It's definitely better to do 2 thin coats than 1 thick one, as the thicker the paint, the more you can see strokes and lines in it as you paint it. Especially when you're working with colors like yellow, this is very important, and it's worth your time doing the thinner coats and building the color up. Then I went in with a scarlet red and started painting the gems on the miniature, especially his gloves and on his helmet. I went with a red color because I really wanted these to pop off the miniature. And since his primary color is blue and silver and tends to be cooler in hues, I felt like this warm red really jumped off the miniature and also went well with the shield that has been painted up. While I had the red paint out, I just went ahead and painted the boar that same bright red. I hemmed and hawed about this for a while. For the longest time I thought about painting the boar blue. as I felt he could be the Blue Boar or something like that as his nickname. But at the end of the day, the paintbrush was already dipped in the red, and I decided to just go with that. Afterwards, I mixed in a little bit of off-white and started highlighting the gemstones. This is a classic way to paint gems. And you just keep adding a little bit more white and painting a smaller and smaller circle inside the gem, until finally finishing it off with just a dot of pure white. If you do a gloss coat over this once it's finished, you get a pretty convincing looking painted gem. And while I had the red paint up and mixed to highlight, I went ahead and highlighted the boar to add it some more detail. Then I decided to paint these little straps on his shield. I didn't really know what color to paint them, and I hemmed and hawed for it a while. But like I said, game day was quickly approaching, so at the end I decided to just go with the same red I used for the boar. Nothing like an approaching deadline to help you make quick decisions to finish a miniature in time. I then went back with an extreme silver and started highlighting the little rivets on the shield. I then used that same silver to paint some little bips and bobs he had hanging off of him and other pieces of jewelry he had weaved into his beard. I then washed this miniature. One of my favorite washes is Secret Weapons Armor Wash. I use this on a lot of metallics. It does great shadows and really can get in and add an extra level of detail to your miniature. This axe especially had some really cool runes carved into the side of it. And while I didn't want to make it look super ornate by individually painting each of those runes, I do think this wash really brought out the detail and showed you that even standard dwarven craftsmanship is a head above anyone else's. And again, since I wanted this miniature to look like his weapons were well cared for, I didn't want any sort of black grease sitting on the finished product. So I used an old makeup brush just to sponge off the wash from the top of the miniature. This left it in the recesses and added great shadowing to the axe. I then also took the Secret Weapons wash and just applied it to all the other metallic bits around the miniature. Secret Weapon is one of my favorite lines for miniature washes, and if you haven't used them out, I would strongly recommend picking some up and giving it a try. Once I was done applying all the Secret Weapons wash, I went back with my Army Painter Strong Tone, and then just inked the entire miniature. When I'm in a hurry and want to finish a miniature and paint it quickly to standard, this is one of my favorite ways to wrap it up. I feel like these strong tones provide nice shadow for a good tabletop quality miniature, and I like the results that gets the job done quickly and gets a miniature on the table. The mini hobby certainly seems to be blowing up, and there is a lot of talented hobbyists showing off their work. And I think this is great. But I do think sometimes some painters get overwhelmed and discouraged when their minis aren't as good as what they see online. I know when I got started, I had the crazy goal of painting an entire army to a golden demon standard, because I thought that's just what good painters do. And obviously, I wanted to be a good painter. However, after 20 years or so of miniature painting, I've realized how insane that goal was, and I've learned to just enjoy the process, not dwell heavily on the end results. I feel like each miniature I paint gets better, and at the end of the day, having shelves of fully painted RPG figs always impresses my friends and fellow gamers. And it's fun to look at, even if they aren't painted to the highest quality. Well, that's it. I had a lot of fun painting this little dwarf. You know, sometimes it's fun just to sit it down at the table and paint for no really rhyme or reason, or have any grand plan of what you're going to do. Also, for me, when painting a miniature, sometimes the story just kind of develops itself on the character's backstory. So if you're ever struggling to come up with a character or a villain for an NPC or a campaign that you're running or playing in, maybe just dig through your old bits box or some of your old miniatures collection, or peruse the miniature collection at your local game store and see if you can find anything that just speaks to you. And then as you're building and hobbying that character, the character just kind of comes to life. Anyhow, over here we've linked some videos that YouTube thinks that you might enjoy, or feel free to subscribe down there. I'll see you in the next video. I'm Dave Snodgrass, and this is Table Ready Gaming. Thank you so much for watching.